Okay, let's start by going over the histology for practical 1. Here you will see the thyroid and the parathyroid. The parathyroid is here. It's more compact looking. The parathyroid is going to sit like 4 little BBs on the back of the thyroid gland. So here's the parathyroid gland, and this is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland has a bunch of little fluid-filled pockets. So you need to be able to recognize the parathyroid and the thyroid. So if I asked you what this organ or gland is, you would tell me parathyroid. If I ask you what this organ or gland is, you would tell me thyroid. Now within the parathyroid, you have a few different cells. The main cells, really dark, are called chief cells, and we'll look at that in a few slides. But right now we're going to go through the parts or the structures you need to know in the thyroid gland. So this entire circle right here, so the outer lying cells along with the space in here that has the fluid, this entire structure is called the thyroid follicle. Now within the thyroid follicle, you have the space. This space is called the follicle cavity. Then around the follicles, you will see a ring of cells. Those ring of cells around the follicles are called the follicular cells. Then you have some of these cells out here that are between different follicles. These cells are called C cells. So again, if I ask you organ or gland, you're going to tell me thyroid. If I circle or ask you what this entire structure is called the thyroid follicle. If I ask you what this space is, this space here, here, and here, and here inside each of the thyroid follicles is called the follicle space, or the follicle cavity. The cells that form the ring around the follicles is called the follicular cells. So here's a ring of follicular cells. Here's a ring of follicular cells. Here's another ring of follicular cells. Then you have these little blobs of cells that are located between the follicles. So here's a little blob of cells, this little blob of cells, this little blob of cells right here. Those are going to be called C cells. In your lecture book, you will also see where C cells are also called your parafollicular cells. Here's another picture zoomed way out. So this would be your thyroid gland. And remember, the parathyroid glands look like BBs that are sitting upon the thyroid. So right here, this little dark area right here would be your parathyroid. But in our lab, it's going to look more like this picture up here. Then zooming way in on this parathyroid. So remember this little compact group of cells up here is the parathyroid. So we're going to zoom in on that area so that we can see the 2 different types of cells that you need to identify in the parathyroid gland. You have these dark cells here. All of these dark cells, you'll see them with the yellow arrows here. These are the chief cells. Then you have these cells here where the red arrows are. These are real puffy cells. They almost look like cotton candy in the cytoplasm of these cells. These are called your oxyphil cells. Your oxyphil cells are usually lighter and fluffier, and your chief cells are smaller and denser looking. This is a purple stain. Now let's look at it if we stain this pink. This is more of the look we will get in our lab. So these darker cells right here are going to be your chief cells. And then you see these cells with the lighter cotton candy puffy look. These are going to be your oxyphil cells. So here's an oxyphil cell. Here's an oxyphil cell. This powdery pink up here is an oxyphil cell. Here's one here. Here's one here. Okay, so again, the chief cells are darker and more compact, and the oxyphil cells are fluffier and look kind of like cotton candy in the cytoplasm. Okay, now let's go down to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is the little gland that hangs down from the brain. The pituitary gland has two main lobes. You'll see this large general area here is the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and the darker side here is the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So your anterior lobe is always going to be darker than your posterior lobe. So it doesn't matter which direction they flip this slide. The posterior lobe is always going to be light, and the anterior lobe is always going to be dark. You can also tell it's pituitary because there are three general regions here. You have the light posterior lobe, you have the dark anterior lobe, and then you have this little border here, which usually involves almost like a little crater. Okay, so that's how you can recognize the pituitary gland. Now, within the pituitary gland, when you're looking at it microscopically, you have specific regions, which are specific tissue regions within the pituitary gland. So these within the posterior lobe here, you have this light area, specifically is called the pars nervosa. This area right in the middle here between the anterior and posterior, this is called your pars intermedia. Intermediate means between. And then back here, this specific area is called your pars distalis. So if you're thinking about your anterior lobe as being dark, dark with a D, your pars distalis, distalis with a D, both go in that anterior lobe area. So dark anterior lobe, pars distalis. In the middle is your pars intermedia, and within the general area of the posterior lobe, you have this specific tissue area called your pars nervosa. So in here, how do you know if they're asking for the lobe or the pars? Again, look up here. If I ask the general area, I'm asking which lobe. If I ask the specific area, I'm asking for the pars. So here is another picture of the pituitary gland. This one's a little harder to identify, but you still have the three regions. You have the light region. You have, see your little crater right here. It's not as defined in this one. This is your pars intermedia. And then here, the darker area is your pars distalis. This one up here is more what we see in our lab. Then you have the thymus gland. If you've ever looked at the lung on one of our lung models in the lab, that's kind of what the thymus gland looks like. That's all you have to identify for this one. So I would have a slide looks like this, and I would say identify this organ or gland, and you would tell me the thymus gland. Then going down to the adrenal gland. Remember, the adrenal gland are those little triangular hat little glands that sit upon the kidneys. So you'll have a left adrenal gland and a right adrenal gland. And if you cut this open, this is what you're going to be seeing microscopically. So you have the capsule up top. So this is the airy space out here. So the very top right here is your adrenal capsule. Then within the adrenal gland, you have two main or general areas. You have this lighter area up here. This is going to be your adrenal cortex. So all of this area right here is the adrenal cortex. And then you have the very center or the middle of the adrenal gland. This is your adrenal medulla. So a cortex is always going to sit just below the capsule, and a medulla is always going to be in the middle. So again, you have on top here, you have the adrenal capsule. Then this lighter area just under the capsule is the adrenal cortex. And then inferior to the adrenal cortex, right in the middle, you have the adrenal medulla. So again, the cortex and the medulla are your general areas. But I can also ask you the specific layers within or that make up this adrenal cortex. You have this top layer called the zona glomerulosa, the light middle area called the zona fasciculata, and then the bottom layer of the adrenal cortex called the zona reticularis. So again, if you see a picture like this or a slide that looks like this, and I ask you to identify the organ or gland, I'm asking you to say adrenal gland. If I ask you this structure or layer up here, I'm asking for the capsule. If I ask you this general area, adrenal cortex, identify this general area, adrenal medulla. If I'm asking you to identify this specific layer, I'm asking for the zona glomerulosa. If I ask to identify this lighter specific layer here, I'm asking for the zona fasciculata. And to identify this specific layer here is the zona reticularis. And remember that these three zonas make up the adrenal cortex. This is another picture of the adrenal glands. So up here, right here, especially on this side, you can see the capsule really well. So identify this general area would be the cortex, the adrenal cortex. This general area would be the adrenal medulla. Identify this specific layer right here would be the zona glomerulosa. This light area here would be the specific layer called the zona fasciculata. And then this darker bottom layer here would be the zona reticularis. Here is a zoomed out picture of the adrenal gland. So again, if I ask you organ or gland, it's going to be the adrenal gland. If I ask you to identify this top structure right here, it would be the capsule. Identify this general area would be the adrenal cortex. Identify this general area in here would be the adrenal medulla. Okay, the next organ or gland we have is the pancreas. So in the pancreas, what you're looking for are going to be these blobs of lighter cells. They do not have to be circular. So don't think that you have to have a perfect circular blob of light cells to be the pancreas. Sometimes those blobs are a little bit squashed. So for instance, if we're looking down in this picture down here, there is one blob of lighter cells, and here's another blob of lighter cells. Those blobs of lighter cells are called your pancreatic islets, and I know it's islets. I say islets so that you can spell it correctly, because remember, spelling is important on your practicals. So again, these blobs of lighter cells are called pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans. You can put either one on the practical and on the quiz. I'm not sure which one they actually use in the quiz. Then outside of this light blob, you have these groups of cells that almost look hot pink in the center, and then they have a blue outline. Each one of these is called your acini or acinar tissue. So here, these are your acinis, okay, or your acinar tissues. You need to know that this organ or gland is the pancreas. This structure here is called your pancreatic islets or your islets of Langerhans. And these collections of darker cells with lighter centers are called acinar tissue or acini. Okay, then we go down to the testes. So the testes are going to be found only in males, and this is where sperm are produced. The reason they're included in the endocrine system is because the testes are also responsible for producing some of the male hormones. So if I ask you what organ or gland this is, it would be testes. If I ask you what each one of these little structures are, these circular or oval structures, each one of these structures is called a seminiferous tubule. And then you have little blobs of cells that are found between these seminiferous tubules. These little blobs of cells outside of the seminiferous tubules are called the interstitial cells. So again, when you're looking at the testes, they look like little circular structures or little oval structures. This clues you in that you're looking at the testes. If I ask you what each one of these circular structures is called, it's called the seminiferous tubule. And if I ask you what these cells are here and here, these are called interstitial cells. This is a cartoon illustration of the testes. So again, if I ask you what organ or gland this is, you're going to tell me the testes. If I ask you what structures these are, you're going to tell me the seminiferous tubules. And then these cells out here would be your interstitial cells. Now we're going to go to the female. Okay, in the females, you're going to find ovaries, and these are the little egg sacs. And again, we're including them in the endocrine system because these ovaries also produce female hormones. What you're looking for when you're trying to identify ovary are all of these little different cells in here. These are little follicles or pockets that have the developing eggs inside. And inside the ovary, you have eggs at various stages of maturity. So that is the reason you're seeing a lot of these with different looks, okay? So again, in the ovary, what you're looking for are these follicles with these eggs at different stages of delivery. Of development. So this organ or gland would be an ovary. After a woman ejects the egg from this follicle, the egg will travel down into the uterus, and what happens is that egg is being released to be fertilized. If the egg is not fertilized, then the egg will pass on through. After that follicle burps out that egg, it's an empty follicle, and it will be reabsorbed into the body. Those empty follicles are called a corpus. And you have two stages of this corpus or empty follicle being reabsorbed into the body. The one here that looks very granular, this is called the corpus luteum. This one that looks almost like cotton candy or chewed bubble gum is called the corpus albicans. So both of these are found in the ovary, but they are specific cells that you need to know, or specific structures you need to know in the ovary. Again, the corpus luteum is very granular looking, and the corpus albicans sometimes is very hard to see because it is so light, and it usually looks like chewed bubble gum or cotton candy. That is going to conclude what you need to know for your endocrine quiz. We will go over the rest of this histology now. Okay, so for the last part of the histology that you need to know for your first practical, this is the liver. I'm going to go to the second picture first, and then we'll go back to the first picture. So this one is less magnified, and what you'll see in the liver is you have a bunch of these pentagon shapes. Remember, a pentagon is 5-sided, and so you'll see a bunch of these pentagons. That clues you into the fact that you're looking at a liver. And in the center of each of those pentagons is a nice hole there. That's going to be where the blood vessels will travel through these holes, okay? So again, if you see a pentagon with a big hole in the middle, that's a liver. This one is zoomed in, and these are the holes between the two pentagons, or in the middle of those two pentagons. The only thing you have to know there is that that's a liver, okay? This one is a kidney. And the first thing you can see here is it looks kind of similar to the pancreas. The difference here is in the kidney, instead of having blobs of light cells, you're going to have these circular type blobs of darker cells. And if you'll see, all these kidneys are going to be surrounded by this C-shaped void area, okay? So these little balls of cells here are almost shaped like a kidney bean. So the dark cells in the middle, and then this light void around it give a kidney bean shape. So that's going to clue you into this is a kidney. This is zoomed in, and here we see a kidney zoomed out, and you can see each one of these blobs of darker cells with this light halo effect around it, okay? The only thing you have to identify in each one of these is that this organ or gland is a kidney. Organ or gland, kidney. Then we go down into our cardiac muscle. So our cardiac muscle, we had an AP1. Remember, cardiac muscle tissue is going to be branched fibers. So here you'll see goes off this way, and then it branches down here, and it goes here, and then it branches up to here, and it branches over here, and branches this way, and branches this way. So you can see the different branches. You can also see these structures here, these dark lines. Those dark lines are your intercalated discs. So the two things you need to know from a slide that looks like this, if I say, pardon me, if I say identify this tissue, you're going to say cardiac muscle. If I say identify these structures, these dark line structures, you can tell me the intercalated discs. Then we go to the lung. The lung looks like airy popcorn. So you're seeing like each one of these little popcorn kernel. It's very airy looking. That is a lung. That is all you have to tell me right now, is that this organ or gland is a lung. Then we get down to blood. So in blood, you have the liquid portion of the blood, that is called the plasma. Then you have the formed elements in blood. And the formed elements are going to be all the different cells that you see within blood. So the formed elements here, or your blood cells, are divided into white blood cells and red blood cells. So here are the red blood cells down here. They look like little hot pink to light pink donuts. And then all of the white cells you will see have a purple nucleus of some sort. Okay, so again, in blood, you have the liquid plasma, and then you have the formed elements. The formed elements are going to include your white blood cells. Remember, your white blood cells have a purple nucleus, and then your red blood cells. And remember, your red blood cells look like little pink donuts. You will also have little platelets. Here is a platelet right here. They look like a teeny tiny little splat. Okay, I know that's kind of odd, but that's kind of what they look like when you're looking at them underneath the microscope. So in this, let's start identifying some of the cells. So in here, where it looks like nothing, that's going to be your matrix called the liquid plasma. So if I point to the middle of nothing and I say identify the matrix, you're going to tell me plasma. If I ask you to identify this cell right here, you're going to tell me a platelet. Remember, platelets are very teeny tiny compared to the rest of the blood cells. Then all these little pink cells here that look almost like donuts, these are going to be your red blood cells. Your red blood cells are also called erythrocytes. Erythro means red. So these are your erythrocytes. Then all of these bigger cells that have a purple nucleus are going to be called your white blood cells. But you need to be able to identify each one of these white blood cells. So let's go through some of them now. Okay, this one here that is very lobed nucleus, that is called a neutrophil. So in a neutrophil, you have very light granules in the cytoplasm, but a very lobed nucleus. So that's a neutrophil. It's called a neutrophil because the little granules are staining a neutral stain. So they're not very distinct. Then this one here, the E right here, is called the eosinophil. The eosinophil is an acidic granule in the cytoplasm, and they're going to stain a orange to a hot pink. And you'll see this is much pinker than this neutrophil down here. This is called an eosinophil. And again, here you will see a lobed nucleus. Then down here, this one with a very, very dark purple to black granules in there, this is called a basophil. It's called a basophil because these are very dark staining granules in here, very basic granules. So this is a basophil. So these are your granulocytic cells, meaning they have granules found in the cytoplasm. Okay, eosinophil, orange to bright pink granules, basophil, dark blue, black, purple granules, and neutrophils, very, very light granules in the cytoplasm. And again, because these all have granules in their cytoplasm, these are your granulocytic white blood cells. You'll need to know that for lab and lecture. This cell over here is called a lymphocyte. A lymphocyte is just a little bit bigger than your red blood cells. And in your lymphocyte, you'll see a circular or an oval nucleus that takes up almost the entire cell. This is an agranulocytic cell. It does not have granules in the cytoplasm. Okay, there was one cell we missed. Oh, this one up here. This one is a monocyte. A monocyte is larger than a lymphocyte, and the nucleus can almost be kidney bean shaped or circular. And in this one, you're going to have a lot more cytoplasm than you do in a lymphocyte. So it just looks like a much larger lymphocyte with more cytoplasm and a kidney bean shaped nucleus. So these are agranulocytic because they don't have very distinct granules in the cytoplasm. These three right here, your eosinophil, neutrophil, and basophil, are your granulocytic cells. The white blood cells can also be called leukocytes. Leuko means white. So leukocytes are your white blood cells. Again, here we talked about your liquid matrix. The liquid part of the blood is called plasma. And then your formed elements in the blood are going to include all your cells. So your red blood cells, you can see it abbreviated here, RBCs, are also called your erythrocytes. Your formed elements also include the platelets. Remember, here's a platelet down here. They're little teeny tiny little splat cells. Then in the formed elements, you also have your white blood cells, abbreviated WBCs, also called your leukocytes. And you have two, I'm losing my train of thought here. Two types of white blood cells. You have your agranulocytic cells. Your agranulocytic cells are going to include your monocytes and your lymphocytes. Then you have your granulocytic cells, which are going to include your basophils, eosinophils, and your neutrophils. Also in our blood unit, you have to be able to identify this disease state right here. This disease state is called sickle cell anemia. It's found very often in the continent of Africa. This is due to a genetic variant. And the reason this is important over in Africa is because people with sickle cell trait do not get malaria. So it is very helpful to the people who live in Africa to keep them from getting the malarial disease. But when you have a mom and a dad that both carry the sickle cell anemia trait and they mate, their child can get sickle cell anemia. That means he's inherited the sickle cell from his mother and his father, and that person can be extremely ill. They will have an enlarged spleen, and they will be destroying a lot of their red blood cells, which will cause them to be anemic. They will have to get a lot of transfusions throughout their life to be able to maintain somewhat quality of life. But what is very distinct in here is you see these sickle-shaped cells. A sickle is an instrument that used to be used to cut grains such as wheat and to cut grasses. So if you've ever seen some pictures of the olden days or back in the pioneer days, you saw a farmer that carried this stick, and at the bottom of the stick is a crescent moon shaped blade. That instrument is called a crescent, or a sickle, sorry. So each one of these resembles that sickle shaped blade. So this is called sickle cell anemia. Again, if you see this and I ask you to identify it on a practical, you're going to tell me sickle cell anemia. And that covers all of the histology that you need to know for practical 1.